Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Christians are being discriminated against, say a group of Christian MPs today. Just the latest salvo in an increasingly hot-tempered public struggle between religious believers and so-called militant atheists. And yet, many people, perhaps most people, live their lives in a tepid, confusing middle ground between strong belief and strong disbelief. Today, we are also gathered on what I would suggest is that more interesting, debatable territory. Karen Armstrong is a former nun who's written brilliantly about the origins of different religions and is asking, what is religion? The novelist Jonathan Safran Foer has overseen a new translation of the Haggadah, the Jewish handbook for Passover, an example of religion as ritual, eating, remembering, debating. The playwright Helen Edmondson's got a new play out, The Heresy of Love, about the Mexican nun and writer Sister Juana, who confronted the Catholic hierarchy and lost. And we're going to kick all of this off with the former Scottish Anglican bishop and radical Richard Holloway, whose latest book he calls A Memoir of Faith and Doubt, leaving Alexandria. Alexandria being the small town in Scotland where you came from, Richard. And you left Alexandria initially to join a sort of Anglican. Well, it's not a monastery, but it's an all-male group of Anglicans working together in England.
It was technically a religious house. Monasteries are applied to monks, but it's become generic for almost any form of religious congregation. It was founded by a Victorian genius called Herbert Kelly, who thought it odd that God didn't call working-class boys into the Anglican priesthood, and so he started a seminary to train poor boys for the Anglican ministry. I went there when I was 14.
And you went there when you were 14, and you thought you were embarking on a life of dedication to Christ and a religious life, and you pursued that life for a very long time. Indeed, you rose to be a bishop, and this book is about your struggle with faith, what faith meant to you as your views sort of matured and changed.
All of those things, one of the things I say in the book is that we live our lives forward, but we understand them backward. We commit ourselves when we're young to ways of life, to relationships that maybe we're not suited to. And looking back, I can see that I was the kind of person who was going to be intrinsically uncomfortable in big organised institutional religion with very fixed rules. And I came to believe that those rules were damaging humanity because they were so fixed, and most of them were fixed 2,000-3,000 years ago. So it makes it very difficult for religions to change appropriately. I mean, I think we should withstand a lot of the ugly stuff that's going on in our culture, but the liberationist movements, I think we should embark with and join with, and they're stopped as well because these old nostrums say no.
And you left the course that would have taken you to the full priesthood partly because you wanted to marry and have relationships. But it seems to me that the most important part of your life in terms of changing your views was working in the really roughest parts of Glasgow, in the Gorbals, when you decided that you were going to try and, because you found in many respects the abstract notion of faith difficult, you wanted to go and live it and practice it.
The thing that stayed with me is Jesus, and Jesus was a radical. I think he said a very simple thing. He said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That relativizes all human institutions. It means that they're actually, if they get in the way of individual human flourishing, you should challenge them. And one of the things that we were trying to do in the Gorbals was, in a sense, to apply that radicalism to powerful institutions that were destroying the very fabric of the Gorbals, because you had the town planning orthodoxy of the 60s, which was knock all those wonderful terraces down and build the big sky rises, what Billy Connolly called deserts with windies. They're all coming down now. So it seems to me that the people at the bottom are constantly being done unto by powers that be, that think, that know what's good for them. And it happens in religion, it happens in politics. And I think that more and more of us should be challenging these dogmatisms. And they're as profound in politics as they are in theology.
One of the most challenging things about your memoir, I thought, was that it's about the move towards disbelief, if I can put it that way, or agnosticism and so on. And yet again and again, the really good people in your book, the people who are actually doing good things and living for other people and not for themselves, are people of faith. They may be people of political faith, or they may be people of religious faith. And so the challenge is that in a world which has become tepid and agnostic, where do the good people come from who go and do these things? Because these are people who have been driven to act in very altruistic ways because of their beliefs.
And I think that still happens, but I think you need to make a difference, and it's one of the things that Karen will certainly point to. There's a difference between faith and belief. Faith is a kind of trust in the somethingness of life, that there is something about love and compassion and pity that are appropriate to our humanity. Beliefs are very specific propositional things that claim to trap the mystery of the universe in a formula. And one of the reasons we're having such a punch-up in Britain at the moment is because you've got people who are trying to do that both for and against religion. They know what the universe is ultimately about. It's ultimately about emptiness, or it's ultimately about a very controlling God. These are intrinsically unknowable things, which is why I think we need a more modest approach to all of these things. We need to be able to live with unknowability. And that's why I believe expectant agnosticism is a more appropriate, ethical and compassionate way to live nowadays.
And just for those people listening who don't know, you rose to be an Anglican bishop in Scotland, a favourite football for the newspapers from time to time. You got a fair kicking. But in some respects, not unreasonably, because you did lose your traditional belief, if not faith. How would you describe yourself now?
I would call myself a Christian agnostic, in the sense that I no longer have a hold on a kind of supernatural understanding of anything outside the universe. I think the universe itself is intrinsically mysterious. I mean, I think that Wittgenstein was right when he said, "Not what, but that the world is the mystical." And so I'm a religious person, but I don't think you can tie this mystery into a formula, either saying what it is not or what it is. And I prefer to live with that kind of balanced agnosticism that reverences religion, because religion carries many wonderful values. It carries mercy and forgiveness and compassion, as well as over-defining mystery. And I think if we could purge religion of its more dogmatic side, maintain its symbolic role. I mean, we're going to be talking about the Seder at the moment. There is a sense in which religion enables us to symbolize our mortality, our transitoriness in rituals and ceremonies. I think if we could keep those for religion, but purge it of its attempt to drive people in a particular direction, I think we could all be liberated and sweetened somehow and live more good-natured, compassionate lives.
Karen Armstrong, you were nodding that in some ways you've lived a parallel life experience. You were a nun and you left that life. But how would you describe yourself?
Convalescent, I think. I had a very, very difficult religious life as a young woman that left me scarred, and I wanted never to have anything to do with religion ever again.
And you spent your entire life writing about it.
Well, yes. But what actually helped me to convalesce was the study of other faiths and the study of what religion used to be. I mean, this new dogmatism is a modern development. The word belief used to mean commitment. In the late 17th century, it changed its meaning to mean an intellectual acceptance of a set of propositions. First, by people like Newton, we were beginning to make knowledge a more notional thing.
So we've got an agnostic Christian, a convalescent, Jonathan Safran Foer. How would you describe yourself in religious terms?
You know, the way I often answer that question is by saying I'm not only agnostic about the answer, I'm agnostic about the question. It's hard to know what somebody means when they ask you, are you a believer? Are you a person of faith? There's obviously some definition by which the answer would be yes, and there are a lot of definitions by which my answer would be no. I can tell you that God is not really at the root of my religious or Jewish experience. I'm much more attracted to a certain set of values, a certain kind of questioning and organizing of time, particularly family time. So I don't know that question is at the heart of my Jewish experience.
You see, you ask a Jewish person something, you get a series of debating propositions back again.
I should have said I'm going to answer your question with the question. Yeah.
Exactly. And Helen Edmondson, your play, which we're going to come on to later on in the programme, the story of Sister Juana, who is an intensely religious but sort of tough, rebellious writer, nun in Mexico.
Yeah.
Just to kind of complete the circle, where are you in religious terms?
I would say that I'm also agnostic, but I would say that I want to be a believer. I think that something in me has always made me want to believe.
There's a yearning.
But I haven't found a religion yet which I feel I could truly belong to and completely commit to. So I'm a sort of floating voter.
Floating voter. Okay. So I kind of feel we've demonstrated quite clearly when we said we were on the debatable middle ground, that is exactly where we are. I just want to come back to Richard Holloway and talk a little bit about the nature of the book you've written, because we get lots of histories of modern times. You get histories of modern times which tell us about the cars or the music or the clothes or whatever. This is interesting because it's a history of how people have been thinking their way through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. And in a way, we perhaps lack this kind of history. This is something that's missing. There's a silence. It's either silence of assent or dissent. I don't know which.
Was that? I think that you're onto something. I think, in a sense, it's a lived experience. And I think that more and more people are beginning to write kind of unofficial histories. You get a lot of communities doing a kind of organic expressions of the experience they've been through. And I think one of the things that maybe I'm typical of is that I've gone through this whole process I'm an old man now, I'm 78, and I've gone through, I think, a transition that's happened to Britain. It's not anti-religious, but it's lowering the tone, taking the noise out. There was an English theologian who said that Christianity is like a swimming pool. All the noise is at the shallow end. And I think that what a lot of us are trying to do is to deepen and make religion a bit more quiet.
But in terms of actually helping people, being out in the community, changing people's lives, through most of your life, that has been done through institutions, organisations, churches, groups of monks, whatever it might be. Isn't there a terrible danger that as everybody becomes deep, sophisticated, at the deep end, they drift away from the institutions and that practical action disappears?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that saddens me about the eclipse of religion is that a lot of that kind of unofficial caring that still goes on in parishes all over this great city of London. There's a lot of that. I mean, you see it in that soap opera television Rev at the moment. You see what the average parish priest is doing and confronting every day, and it's unsung. And the motivation is usually something a bit more questionable, which is a kind of maybe a commitment to a dogmatic understanding of reality. I'd hate to see that going.
Karen, let's talk about, first of all, how you define religion now. I want to come back to this business of institutions and the importance of institutions and how we live without them.
Well, religion. When you ask what is religion, it's now generally accepted in religious studies that is an absolutely impossible question to answer. It covers such a wide range of activities.
Activities, though, not beliefs.
Not beliefs.
Right.
That is a very peculiar Western Christian modern development. We talk about religious people as believers, as though accepting certain creedal ideas and was the main thing that they did. In fact, in Judaism, certainly, in Islam, in Buddhism, in all the great faiths, and formally in Christianity.
It's what you do.
You learn by doing. Religious truth is a form of practical knowledge. You like driving or swimming. You can't learn to swim by reading a book.
So we're talking about giving alms, meditation, prayer.
Yes, rituals that change your behaviour at a profound level. The ethic of compassion, which is key to the major world faiths, the test of true spirituality, which means that you have to dethrone yourself from the centre of your world and put another there. When you get rid of ego, You begin to sense the divine. When people cling to beliefs, they're clinging on to something egotistic. My beliefs, my church, my institution. And this is a form of idolatry, really. And there was a long period, a long tradition in the Christian tradition, in the Western Christian tradition, which said that you could not say anything definite about God. Thomas Aquinas, who's famous for having proved God in 5 propositions, then, after he's made these proofs, pulls the rug out from under us and says, but we don't know what it is we've proved. All we've proved is the existence of a mystery. We have no idea what we mean when we say God. So we've lost that sense of the apophatic, and I think that that almost the institutions are doing a fabulous job of putting themselves out of business.
How are they doing that?
By stressing that looking for unrealistic certainty. Uncertainty, unknowing, is built into the human condition. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was widely thought that there were just a few outstanding problems left in the Newtonian system, and then our knowledge of the universe would be completely sewn up. But then 20 years later, we have Einstein. We have an indeterminate universe. And Einstein said that to live in the presence of what is impenetrable and incomprehensible to us is a source of great joy. Not a frustration, but a source of great joy.
Sorry, would you think, therefore, that those bishops and others who get very hot under the collar, hot under the dog collar, about Richard Dawkins and about the so-called militant atheists at the run, they would be much better off saying, well, that's very interesting. What we do is we pray and we go out and work with people in the community and we express our love and our compassion in this way. That's what we do.
Yes.
And go no further.
And that we don't know. Atheistic certainty is equally unrealistic. There is no certainty. Militant atheism is another form of dogmatism, in a sense, and often expressed in a quite rude and uncompassionate way. So I think Socrates, at the heart of the rational tradition, said on the last day of his life that he was wise in only one respect, that he knew nothing at all. And that is a thread that runs through the great traditions. In Buddhism, you cannot define nirvana. That good theology, in the old days, good theology, would push you to a point where your mind tipped into transcendence, where you listened to the ludicrousness of what you were saying about God and said, I compare it to the moment at the end of a symphony. When the last notes die away, there's often a pregnant pause in the concert hall before the applause starts.
A bubble, yes.
And theology should be at its best, should be helping us to live in that moment of silence.
Now, Karen Armstrong, you're talking as a philosopher. I want to ask you again about institutions, however, because, you lived a lot of your life in institutions. And in terms of, on the one hand, you're saying religion is what we do, is what people do, it's practice. It's not an intellectual construct. Does that mean that it's important that the institutions, the faiths, the groups, the churches, and so on, carry on because they are struggling in many cases?
They will struggle if they can't adapt. When the faith traditions cease to be able to adapt to their current conditions, they die. That's what happened to the old paganism. Plus, institutions are important because they help to preserve wisdom. An inherent centuries worth of wisdom, so we don't all have to reinvent the wheel. But you can have institutional idolatry, where the institution becomes an end in itself instead of the unknowable God.
Helen Edmondson, you wanted to come in on this, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about comfort in religion, and I was just thinking about for somebody who is coming to the end of their life, or who needs to know that there is an afterlife, or who wants that sort of reassurance. Is it enough to just say, well, we don't know?
I think, actually, only 2 of the world religions have anything to say about afterlife. It's not a big deal in Judaism, is it, at all? It's in Christianity and Islam. And even there's very little about the afterlife, actually, in the Gospels. But I think comfort is something that you work for, This is the hard work of religion, where you work to change basic impulses like ego, so that you learn to live in peace and kindly with problems for which there are no solutions, like mortality, like injustice, like cruelty.
We've talked in the abstract then about the doing, the practice. I want to come on to Jonathan Safran Foer and talk a little bit more about that, because you've produced a very beautiful new edition of the Haggadah, which is I've called it the handbook for Passover. But perhaps we need to unpack that explanation to start with, Jonathan.
What the book is in the first place?
Exactly, yes.
Well, I guess we should start with what Passover is. Passover is the most widely celebrated Jewish holiday, and by a long shot. 250,000 people attend Seders on the Upper West Side of Manhattan every year. And for many, many Jews in America, it's a kind of last ritualistic connection to Judaism. And it's a very peculiar one because it is somewhat esoteric. It's not easy. It's not altogether accessible, and it requires, as you said, a handbook.
And it is a meal which is about praise and praying, but also about remembering.
It's really not about praise and praying. It's more about reenacting the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The sort of central trope of the Seder is that you are supposed to feel as if you yourself were liberated from Egypt, and it's a real radical act of empathy. It's not.
So, for instance, the unleavened bread is because there wasn't time for the bread to rise when the
Jews
Exodus
were fleeing the Pharaoh, fleeing the Egyptians. There's a kind of tension in the evening between celebrating one's freedom, acting in a way that befits free men, it said, and this empathy for not only the slavery of our ancestors, but for any forms of contemporary slavery.
And in terms of religion, the fact that this is a celebration and active remembering, which is about eating, which is about sort of ritual questions, the youngest person in the room asking a series of questions and getting answers, as well as remembering the text and so on. The fact that it's physical makes it much more emotional. I mean,
well, it's organized. The point of the evening is to transmit values, and so a lot of the decisions that seem to have been made in terms of how we would celebrate it are toward that end. It's in the house. It is organized around a meal. The rituals are often esoteric, but always seemingly in the interest of keeping everyone at the table engaged, and it's a great story. Jews have a good way of embedding laws within stories, or embedding morals within stories, and stories that can sustain themselves. I mean, have sustained themselves over thousands of years.
And in this version, you have 4 other writers who produce different kinds of analysis or sort of textual commentary as the meal progresses, as the Seder progresses, asking different kinds of questions. And this is also important. Why?
Well, asking questions from different perspectives. So Jeffrey Goldberg writes from the perspective of Jews as a nation, as a people. What political lessons can be, or what political questions can we ask, really, about the Seder? Rebecca Goldstein writes from a kind of psychological, literary perspective. What's going on in the story here? Why would these characters be acting in these ways? Nathaniel Deutsch writes from a more traditional rabbinic philosophical perspective.
And Lemony Snicket has the fun bit.
yeah. And Lemony Snicket asks questions that are geared toward the youngest people at the table.
Yes.
So it's a book that can be used differently by different people and used differently over time. It's a very beautiful. I should say it's a very, very beautifully produced book.
Beautiful.
And the Hebrew script changes during the book.
Right, the Hebrew script, there's a timeline that runs graphically across the top of the book, which is sort of the story of the story, how the Exodus has been used at different moments in Jewish history and borrowed by different cultures. And the design of the book follows that timeline.
And embedded in the commentary, there's a lot of argument and questioning about, ethical ways to behave. What does the Exodus mean? Who are the oppressed people now? How do we treat oppressed people? Do we think of Jews first, or do we think of other oppressed people first? And all of that. But the problem, in many respects, with the story is these terrible plagues, because there is an almost sort of triumphalist note about all the terrible plagues that have visited on the Egyptians for their behaviour to the Jews.
It's not the only complicated moment in the
No.
Haggadah. It's a very fraught document, and I don't think it would have, lasted this long if it weren't, frankly,
Yeah.
and it wouldn't be as, it is only because it's provocative that it's so rich.
Yes.
And what you'll find is the Haggadah disagrees with itself.
Just for those who don't know, I should list them, I think. We should list the plagues.
Why not?
Blood, frogs, lice, a maelstrom of beasts, pestilence, boils, hail full of fire, locusts, a clotted darkness too thick to pass, and then the killing of the firstborn. That's a heck of a...
Be nice to your neighborhood Jew, I guess, is the moral of the story.
Or else.
Yeah. But what's interesting is Nathaniel Deutsch, I was saying, who's a Jewish scholar. He's the grandson of one of Hungary's most famous rabbis, and quite a devout person by his own definition, is very comfortable questioning God's motives in his commentaries and asking about the balance of justice and mercy. So one thing that I have always loved about Judaism as it was experienced in my family and in my education is that there were no questions that you weren't allowed to ask.
Yeah. Karen?
That's what I loved about Judaism when I first encountered it. And this is precisely what I was talking about earlier. Here in this marvellous document, you've got a conundrum, a problem that can't be solved about human power, human liberation. I remember once...
But you've got a way of talking about it as well.
And dealing with it and grappling with it in the course of every year, making yourself grapple with this. I remember once going to Senegal and visiting the slave house there where the slaves were stored before they were shipped off to the United States and Europe. And it was built in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. Very often freedom for some means slavery and suffering for others. And this is a conundrum of human history. And that this is what the Haggadah is every year makes one confront.
Richard
And
Holloway.
it also points to a comparatively recent mistake in religion, which is to interpret these great texts literally. And that's very, very modern. This has been interpreted allegorically. It's been used to question and challenge God. And we should treat these old texts in that way. They're great living human documents. And to treat them as some kind of divine dictation that permanently orders us to follow particular values is religiously illiterate, and there's a hell of a lot of that around, alas.
And in Judaism, you must always, it was a principle of rabbinic interpretation of Bible, you must always find something new in the text and bring it to your community.
I just want to come back to something that is in Richard's book about the emptiness and the hollowness with loss of traditional faith, because this is, you say this shouldn't be interpreted literally as the word of God, and yet, in a way, that's why it survived, because so many people have interpreted it for so long. You're shaking your head. I'll let you come in a second. You're all shaking your heads. I was going to just ask about the intimacy, though, and the warmth. The fact that these are warm family ritual occasions. We had a Muslim writer on the show not so long ago who said, very interesting, what you have to remember is that as a Muslim, the first words you hear are the Quran being recited by your mother. It's a very intimate thing that happens inside the family. It's that intimacy. And that intimacy is what, as a culture, we're all losing, isn't it?
And I think that one of the things I think we are losing in no longer being observant or attendant is that you no longer join strangers to sit and think about values and meaning once a week. And I think that's what church is good at. And I hope that we never lose that. I think that there are places that do it in an open and generous way. And that don't. Yes, I think that there are many Christian communities, many Jewish communities, Buddhist communities. I don't know enough about Islam to know whether they're experimenting in making this so spacious that you can enter it without, as it were, being intellectually abused, which I think a lot of very, very conservative Christianity does.
I'm just intrigued that there are such places, because I think for most of us, there are churches, there are temples, whatever it might be, and you're either inside or you're outside.
Well, I go to a church in Edinburgh that's very, very ritualistic, does a lot of very advanced symbolic liturgy, but intellectually it's really a very spacious place. I mean, I'm in a sense on the edge of it. I want these places to continue because they carry important memories. They carry the memory of Jesus, and without the church we wouldn't know about that extraordinary man, just as the Hebrew scriptures carry extraordinary stories as well. But how we enable these institutions to continue and also adapt in appropriate ways to the real current needs of humanity is a very difficult question, and the institutions aren't getting it.
No.
I want to hit the rewind button at this point and go back to a society which is still very much in the grip of traditional hierarchic religion, which is Mexico in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Late 1700s.
Late 1600s. Late 1600s.
Late 1600s, right. I beg your pardon. Under the control of Roman Catholic Archbishop, Mexico City. And Helen Edmondson, your play, The Heresy of Love, is about this extraordinary writing nun, Sister Juana. Now, you tell us first of all how you came across her, and then tell us her story.
I saw a play at the RSC a few years ago, and it was part of a season of Spanish Golden Age dramas, and it was directed by Nancy Meckler, who I've worked with several times. So I went to see it, and I hadn't really taken in until I went into the theatre that it had been written by a woman. And afterwards, I thought it was a fantastic play. It was funny, it had all those ingredients of the Spanish Golden Age, sort of mistaken identity and the sort of grappling with quite big issues, but trying to also inject some comedy. And afterwards, when I was speaking to Nancy, she said, this woman was a nun. And I hadn't really realised that, and I went away and read as much about her as I could find, and I realised that her story was phenomenal, and that it would make a great play, and it would make a great platform, well, hopefully a great platform for talking about faith in general.
And she poured out literature, didn't she? She wrote devotional plays. She wrote poems.
She did. She wrote. I mean, obviously we don't. There are some of these are extant, and some of them I imagine we've probably lost. But yeah, she wrote well over 200 poems, which we still have. She probably didn't write quite so many plays, but we have 2 complete plays and 1 fragment. And she wrote, a huge number of carols, religious music. She was also very musical. She wrote little sort of, almost like little mystery plays for performance in church. And some of them she even wrote in sort of indigenous languages so that they could be better understood by people coming to watch.
And she was a nun, and to start with, she seems to have been a nun in a society where the convents were sort of part of society. They weren't actually open, but they were very much engaged in the Mexico around them.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There were about 50 convents and monasteries in Mexico City at the time.
And then, stage hiss, the Archbishop arrives from Spain.
Yeah.
And he says no.
Yes, I mean, I think when this particular Archbishop, Aguiar Iseas, took office, he at the time things had become fairly lax in terms. There was what the bishop describes as a system of concessions and demands. So there was a sort of trying to meet the indigenous people halfway, and just sort of possibly because of being quite far away from Spain, think they'd kind of devised their own ways and means of managing.
And if you go into a Mexican church now, it's still the case. I mean, Mexican religion is very, very different. I mean, there's a lot of native, original American religion still mixed up in it. But anyway, she is stopped from writing. She's told to stop it, and she's sort of spiritually crushed. Is she, or she certainly eventually gives in?
She does eventually give in, but not necessarily because. I think what I've done in the play, in the Heresy of Love, is try to set up the idea that it's more to do with her own insecurities and her worries about whether she possibly is using faith for her own means. She's tried to develop she's been forced to develop, because of being a woman in this very, very restricted situation. She's been forced to develop this quite personal and what the Archbishop calls a convoluted path to heaven. She's developed a very personal relationship with God, and what the Archbishop does is he tries to make her see, or tries to make her think, that that was wrong, and that it's actually become a very dangerous thing, that it's meant that she's taken her eye off the ball. In the story I've set up a subplot with her niece, who ends up getting into a terrible situation, and Juana feels that becomes a symbol of what she's neglected.
Karen, to what extent does this story exemplify what you were saying earlier on about the confusion between faith and belief?
Well, I think this is precisely the moment, 17th century, when the changeover is happening, and where for the first time, because of better communications, the institutions can start controlling what people believe in a way that they couldn't before. It was just impossible. Plus, the only person who's talking about religion in this play is Sister Juana.
Yeah.
The others don't. The others are all talking about power and control.
Yeah.
The Archbishop makes only one religious comment, and that's reported, and no one's quite sure what he meant, because they all seem to have been asleep during his sermon. But that Christ has gone and left us. That's a typical ploy of what these theologians, like Aquinas, Bonaventure, who said Christ has left us, so we know nothing, so we know nothing. That's been turned on its head. So what we have here is, this is about empire too, is it not?
Yes, yeah.
This is what happens when you get religion mixed up with imperial control.
Yeah. That's what they were trying to colonise, but also convert, and it was a way of controlling the whole population.
But it also illustrates the way religions get stuck in the cultural norms of a previous era, and there's no doubt at all that most of the great religions were formed during a patriarchal way of running things. Yeah. And what they mistakenly do is they think that incidental historical stuff is integral to the religion. And the big struggle in the church at the moment is still over women, the status of women. I mean, it's pathetic.
Yes, it is.
The world's moved on, but because the Bible, or because some other ancient text, appears to place women permanently in subservience to men, they can't get over it. I mean, my own church is still struggling. The Church of England can't get round to ordaining women bishops because of these ancient texts that they misinterpret.
And this is not foreign to Jewry either, is it, Jonathan? The struggle over the position of women, and
I think it's becoming more and more foreign. I mean, certainly, the conservative reform movements have had female rabbis for quite some time now, and it doesn't feel like an issue that's central to religious experience. In the Orthodox community, it's very much alive.
Yeah.
But
there is a similar sort of division, as it were, as there is in the Christian church about this.
Well, there's a spectrum, something that at one end resembles a kind of fundamentalism, and at the other resembles being secular. And in the Jewish experience that I have had, I wasn't aware of any particular division of sexes.
This is deliberately a conversation which has no conclusion. That is the point. Yeah. However, as we're coming towards the end of it, I'd like to just go around the table and ask you all, given that a lot of people have some yearning for faith, for reaching out, what are the mechanisms? What is your advice mechanically?
I think that find a way of getting together with people to share this kind of stuff. And a lot of it is now happening in secular forms. Churches are still great places to do this. If you can find open churches that allow questions to be asked, that's more interested in asking questions than in saying amen to answers. And there are places around like that. Look for them, or form one yourself.
Karen?
I would say to try to live differently. And then things fall into place about the position of women. Compassion, the ability, or the golden rule, never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself, has been developed independently by all the major world faiths, and it's said to be the test of true spirituality. That's got lost. If you start doing that, everything else, like the position of women, doctrine, falls into place, and you yourself become transformed. But you have to do the golden rule all day and every day, as Confucius said, not just when you feel like it, not just my good deed for the day.
Confucius, who is coming back in China, interestingly enough, in a big way at the moment, yes. Jonathan?
For me, it's about setting aside time. Setting aside time that isn't just domestic, that isn't hustle and bustle, but to ask the questions that don't get asked in daily life. And that's, Judaism, I think, is very good at that, whether it's setting aside time once a week on Shabbat or these annual occasions. And this is what I love about the Seder, and why I wanted to make a Haggadah that would be hopefully a better fit for my family, is if we're going to set aside this time to join, in my case, siblings, parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents at one long table where we're supposed to ask the big questions, we should make that time as precious as it can be.
So it's the ritual is terribly important. Without the ritual, nothing almost. Otherwise you wouldn't set aside the time.
It's very difficult to ask these questions if you don't create a context for them.
Yeah. Helen?
Well, I don't feel that I can really advise people about that, because but I do think that what Juana says at the end of the play is that it should be, that faith should be an expansion. It should be a flight and an endless universe of light. It shouldn't be a shutting down and a closing down. So I think, for me, that's what I'm trying, sort of struggling towards, I think.
A very good note for us to end on. Thank you all very much indeed for that. Helen Edmondson's play The Heresy of Love is on at the Swan Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon until the 9th of March. Karen Armstrong is going to be asking what is religion at the Royal Society of Literature in London next Monday. Jonathan Safran Foer's Haggadah and Richard Holloway's Leaving Alexandria, A Memoir of Faith and Doubt are both out now, and Richard's going to be presenting a series of programmes on doubt for Radio 4 in May. Next week, we have a different kind of crisis. We have time for a midlife crisis. We're going to be talking about middle age with David Bainbridge, Deborah Mogak, Simon Armitage and Claudia Hammond. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
The kind of person who was going to be intrinsically uncomfortable in big organised institutional religion with very fixed rules. And I came to believe that those rules were damaging humanity because they were so fixed, and most of them were fixed 2,000-3,000 years ago. So it makes it very difficult for religions to change appropriately. I mean, I think we should withstand a lot of the ugly stuff that's going on in our culture, but the liberationist movements, I think we should embark with and join with, and they're stopped as well because these old nostrums say no.
And you left the course that would have taken you to the full priesthood partly because you wanted to marry and have relationships. But it seems to me that the most important part of your life in terms of changing your views was working in the really roughest parts of Glasgow, in the Gorbals, when you did by a Victorian genius called Herbert Kelly, who thought it odd that God didn't call working-class boys into the Anglican priesthood, and so he started a seminary to train poor boys for the Anglican ministry. I went there when I was 14. And you went there when you were 14, and you thought you were embarking on a life of dedication to Christ and a religious life, and you pursued that life for a very long time. Indeed, you rose to be a bishop, and this book is about your struggle with faith, what faith meant to you as your views sort of matured and changed.
All of those things, a lot of... One of the things I say in the book is that we live our lives forward, but we understand them backward. We commit ourselves when we're young to ways of life, to relationships that maybe we're not suited to. And looking back, I can see that I was... decided that you were going to try and... Because you found in many respects the abstract notion of faith difficult, you wanted to go and live it and practice it. The thing that stayed with me is Jesus. And Jesus was... a radical. I think he said a very simple thing. He said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That relativizes all human institutions. It means that they're actually, if they get in the way of individual human flourishing, you should challenge them. And one of the things that we were trying to do in the Gorbals was, in a sense, to apply that radicalism to powerful institutions that were destroying the very fabric of the Gorbals, because you had the town planning orthodoxy of the 60s, which was knock all those wonderful terraces places down and build the big sky rises, what Billy Connolly called deserts with windies. They're all coming down now. So it seems to me that the people at the bottom...
Handbook for Passover, an example of religion as ritual, eating, remembering, debating. The playwright Helen Edmondson's got a new play out, The Heresy of Love, about the Mexican nun and writer Sister Juana, who confronted the Catholic hierarchy and lost. And we're going to kick all of this off with the former Scottish Anglican bishop and radical Richard Holloway, whose latest book he calls A Memoir of Faith and Doubt, leaving Alexandria. Alexandria being the small town in Scotland where you came from, Richard. And you left Alexandria initially to join a sort of Anglican... Well, it's not a monastery, but it's an all-male group of Anglicans working together in England.
It was technically a religious house. Monasteries are applied to monks, but it's become generic for almost any form of religious congregation. It was found...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Christians are being discriminated against, say a group of Christian MPs today. Just the latest salvo in an increasingly hot-tempered public struggle between religious believers and so-called militant atheists. And yet, many people, perhaps most people, live their lives in a tepid, confusing middle ground between strong belief and strong disbelief. Today, we are also gathered on what I would suggest is that more interesting, debatable territory. Karen Armstrong is a former nun who's written brilliantly about the origins of different religions and is asking, what is religion? The novelist Jonathan Safran Foer has overseen a new translation of the Haggadah, the Jewish